morning. Open your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 4. The title of the morning message is Facing the Foe. In this chapter, Nehemiah is facing intensifying opposition. In 1934, Hitler called all the church leaders to Berlin to berate them for not supporting his cause sufficiently. Martin Niemöller made this comment. He said, "I'm concerned for the welfare of the church and the German people." Hitler snapped back at him, "You concern yourself with the church. I will take care of the German people." And he fearlessly replied, "We have a responsibility toward the German people," meaning the pastors of Germany, "entrusted to us by God. Neither you nor anyone in the world has the power to take that responsibility from us." This enraged Hitler, obviously. That evening, the Gestapo raided the rectory where Niemöller lived. A few days later, his church was bombed. He was very closely watched. He could have fled, but he didn't do that. He stayed at his post. He was eventually arrested and placed in solitary confinement and tried. His trial began on February the 7th, 1938. The guard led him from the prison cell where he was through an underground passageway toward the courtroom. He was very apprehensive as to what was going to happen. And the guard did not help that any because he was impassive and silent. At the final flight of stairs, however, Niemöller thought he heard a whisper. He wasn't sure where it came from. And then he realized that the guard was whispering in his ear, Proverbs 18:10, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe." Niemöller says at that moment his fear vanished, and it did not return through all the years he spent in Nazi concentration camps. Nehemiah never lost sight of that strong tower. He remembered, as we find in this passage, that the Lord is great and terrible. His enemies tried 3 tactics to destroy him or defeat his work. We're going to look at 4 of them today. Ridicule was the first one. Then there were plots of war. Then there were discouragements of his own people. There was fear. There was selfishness. There was compromise suggested. There was slander. There were threats. And finally, there was intrigue. None of them moved Nehemiah. He was a great leader. His face was set like flint to fulfill his responsibility. Too many leaders give up in the face of opposition. Somebody has said it's easier for most people to face death than it is to face the kind of ridicule that Nehemiah had faced. Now, my parents gave an excellent example as I was growing up. As you all know, I grew up in an apostatizing church. And my father never wavered in what he believed and what he taught. I remember an uncle sitting at the kitchen table in our house arguing with my father. He went along with the drift, and he predicted that my father would lose his family. Well, what was the secret to my father's spiritual strength? I found that out one night when I walked out into the barn for some errand, I forget what it was. And I saw that my father had been there shortly before to look over his cattle. And on the top of the rack where he was standing was his Bible opened. And that was my dad's secret. He believed in God and trusted God. At his funeral, we read a clipping, which I could not find, that talked about all the people in the Bible who stood alone. Now, 3 times in this chapter, Nehemiah focuses on God. That's his response. And I think it's interesting to observe that there are no spectacular miracles in this book. He didn't have God intervene in some spectacular way at any point. Now, he believed that God was involved in all the things we read, but there wasn't that kind of spectacular evidence that most people would have expected in this kind of a situation, that God would somehow swoop down and cause some solution to the problems. That never happened. Nehemiah was facing his problems and trusting God and recognizing God's work in his life just like you and me. And I'm glad there are people like that in the Bible. Another one's John the Baptist. The Bible tells us that he did no miracles. Now, he was Elijah. He was the forerunner, the Elijah that was for to come, and Elijah did a lot of miracles. And John the Baptist could have said, well, if I'm to be Elijah, I better be doing some miracles. And like many people today, he would have made that happen. I'll let you consider what that sometimes represents. So I'm glad we have these characters in the Bible, like Nehemiah, who trust God, who see God's work in the kind of experiences that you and I have constantly. And I think that encourages us to see God's work in ways that are not spectacular. Some people believe, somebody has counted, that there are 40 recorded miracles in the Old Testament. Well, I don't know, I never counted them. But if that's true, that's a period of 4,000 years, so we're talking about an average of 1 per century. And they were in clusters. You have them with Elijah and Elisha and Moses, and that's pretty much where most of them are. The rest of them, there aren't too many of them in the rest of the Old Testament. So now I'm not disclaiming spectacular works of God even today. I'm not discounting that, but I'm saying if Nehemiah was focused on that God's going to show up and he's going to deliver, so we'll pray and we'll just wait till it happens, we wouldn't have the story we have today. So, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go on. Well, first of all, we find in the chapter 2, they tried, first of all, to laugh them out of their resolve as they began. You mean you're going to rebel against the king, this motley assortment of refugees? You're going to rebel against the king of Persia? Come on. That didn't work. The wall building began. And what we all need to understand is if we are involved in God's work, there will be opposition. You will not escape it. In fact, there's a little poem. I hope I can quote it. I didn't write it down. You have no enemies, you say? Alas, my friend, the boast is poor. You've hit no traitor on the hip. You've dashed no cup from perjured lip. You've never turned the wrong to right. You've been a coward in the fight. And so people who do the work of the Lord will have enemies, and they will have opposition, and they will have severe opposition. I really believe that. It's expected. It's an evidence, actually, that God is doing something. Now, people can bring it on themselves. I understand that. But if you feel that you're doing what God has told you to do, and it lines up with the gospel, and it's a matter of prayer and God's guidance, and you have every reason to believe this is God's work, then opposition is an evidence of God's blessing on your work, or you wouldn't be opposed. And not only that, but it will help you grow in your Christian life. So, here is the outline for today. Number 1. Resisting ridicule. Well, you can ridicule my writing here. And that is for 1 to 6. Number 2 is preventing plots. And that is 4, 7 to 9. And the third point is dispelling discouragement. And that is 4 verse 10. And finally, facing fear. And that is 4, 11 to 23. Okay. Resisting ridicule. Now, they had ridiculed them in chapter 2, but when they found out that the wall was actually going to be built, that it did not work, it says they were enraged. In fact, I'd like to read the passage. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 4. But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, what do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity. And cover not their iniquity, but let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. So, that little word appears at the most interesting places in this book. What was their response? So, we built the wall. And all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. And it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up, and that the breaches, amidst the Ashdodites there were 4 groups, and we'll talk about them. When they saw that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth, and conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God, and set a watch against them day and night because of them. And Judah said, the strength of the bearers of the burdens is decayed, and there's much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said, they shall not know, neither see till we come in the midst of them and slay them, and cause the work to cease. And it came to pass that when the Jews which dwell by them came, they said unto us 10 times, from all places whence ye shall return unto us, they will be upon you. Therefore set I in the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places I even set the people after their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, be not ye afraid of them. Remember, the Lord which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters and your wives and your houses. And it came to pass when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, every one into his work. And it came to pass from that time forth that the half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both the spears, the shields, and the bows, and the habergeons. And the rulers were behind all the house of Judah. They which builded on the wall, and they that bare burdens, and those that laded, every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. For the builders, every one had his sword girded by his side, and so builded. And he that sounded the trumpet was by me. And I said unto the nobles and to the rulers, and to the rest of the people, the work is great and large, and we are separated upon the wall, one far from another. In what place, therefore, ye hear the sound of the trumpet, resort ye hither unto us. Our God shall fight for us. So we labored in the work. Half of them held the spears from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. Likewise, at the same time said I unto the people, let every one with his servant lodge within Jerusalem, and in the night they may be a guard unto us, and labor on the day. So neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard which followed me, none of us put off our clothes, saving that every one put them off for washing. All right, resisting ridicule. Sanballat and his friends, up until until Nehemiah came, had dominated this region. And we find later in the book had profited financially. So their power and their wealth depended on keeping these people under their control. And if the city had no wall around it, these people were constantly vulnerable. And we're going to find as we go through the book that they were in really, really dire circumstances. So, they ridiculed them. The first thing they did was they ridiculed the people. Goliath, remember, ridiculed David. Remember, they ridiculed Christ on the cross. This is a very common way that people deal with their opposition. They said, you're feeble. The word here means withered, like a cut flower. Now, the world does not understand the Christian strength. They believe, and we're seeing it in the political world, that everything depends on their armies, their power, their wealth, and so they build those up against the enemy. God's people, as we learned this morning in Sunday school, they glory in their poverty. Paul says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. He glories in his poverty. He glories in his persecutions. He glories in all the things that the world would say are weak and feeble. Now, I couldn't help comparing this with my experience with the Christian Day School movement. And so I'm going to compare it as we go down through this. I was teaching back in the middle 60s, and many of our people did not have Christian day schools at that point. By the way, our people had Christian day schools at the beginning. They were probably a better educated group of people than the people around them because they thought it was important. The Anabaptists always thought it was important that all of their children learn to read so they could read the Bible. And so we had our own schools. They were church schools at the beginning in this country. And then slowly but surely, the state sort of said, well, you know what? We have a school building here, and some of them are even your own teachers, and we can finance this. And so our people eventually ended up in public school. And it was a little bit like a Nehemiah enterprise to get that reversed. Okay? And there was ridicule. There was ridicule. There were people who said, we don't have the resources. You think you're going to have a Christian day school? That's ridiculous. Look, the state schools, they have money, they have resources, they have trained teachers, and you people are going to have a Christian day school? And so we were up against a certain amount of ridicule. All right? So they ridiculed the people to begin with. Then they ridiculed their work. They said, you're going to sacrifice? You really think that a little bit of prayer and a little bit of sacrifice and a little bit of worship is going to help you build this wall? So they ridiculed the work. And you're going to build a wall around a city? You have no idea. This is a huge project, folks. You'll never do that. It's not possible. And I thought of the Christian Day School movement again. The work, uneducated school teachers. Who ever heard of such a thing? To be a teacher, you have to have a certificate from a college. You have to have trained people, and we don't have those people. It's not possible. This work is impossible. Then they ridiculed the materials. They said, you're trying to build a wall out of materials that have been burned and weakened and almost destroyed, and you're going to take those materials and you're going to build a wall to protect this city from an army? Are you kidding? And of course, they had the accusation, the ridicule that a fox, which I understand steps very lightly, A fox, because of these damaged materials, a fox is going to tear this wall down. This wall is not going to hold anything. And then people ridiculed the unprofessional curriculum that some people started to use in the Christian day school. They didn't think it was a very good product. They're very good materials. And then finally, they ridiculed the finished product. They said, if they get it built, it won't protect them anyway. And so they had all this ridicule against the people, against the work, against the materials, against the finished product. I mean, even if you get the wall built, it won't amount to anything, because how would you folks ever be able to build a wall that would keep out an army? Well, somebody has said ridicule is the language of the devil. Now, Nehemiah sees it as a serious affront to God. And so he prays against them. Now, his prayer is sort of an imprecatory prayer, and I don't think it's appropriate for Christians to pray that kind of prayer, which says, don't forgive them, don't cover their iniquity, let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they provoke thee to anger before the builders. I don't think you pray those kinds of prayers, but there is a prayer I pray every day, and I heard Brother Brandon pray something similar this morning. Every day I pray, Lord, bring down everything that is false, destroy it, and prosper everything that's right in the world, in the church, in the nation. I pray that every day, that God would destroy anything that's false and prosper everything that's right, and would get glory to his great name as a result. Well, what was their response? Well, look at verse 6. So, we just kept building. You heard me the other Sunday talk about music and teaching music. One thing that a good leader knows he never does, and that is quit. It doesn't matter what's happening, that's not an option. You don't quit. Because the wall was the very thing that was going to keep them from everything that they were being told. That was going to be the thing that was going to, in the end, be their help. So they kept building. And they got it up to the half the height, the whole way around the city, for the people had a mind to work. They were enthused about this project. But you have opposition. You have the Samaritans here. You have the Arabians down here. You have the Ammonites over here. And down here in Gaza, you have the Philistines, the Ashdodites. However, okay. So there they are. They all come together, and enemies do that when they're opposing somebody. They might have fought each other at various times, but this united them. And here they are surrounded by these enemies. And they conspired. I mean, we read this book and we don't realize this was really a dangerous project. This was real opposition. This was a cause for real discouragement and fear. Okay? They were no match for these people. They were no match for them at all. I mean, these people had armies. They had resources. These people were poor. They didn't have an army. They had to depend on God. Okay? So, it was watch and pray. Notice, they prayed and they made a watch. They did both. They did both. While we're working for the Lord, we have to do two things. We have to work in the kingdom and we have to watch. I think about the beginning of the last century when our people were threatened with modernism. All of Christianity was threatened with modernism that says God can't do any miracles. So you go through the Bible and you give a naturalistic explanation for all the miracles. That was modernism, in short. And you find clever ways to say all kinds of things. That Isaiah only wrote one part of his book and the other part was written after the fact. And, you know, all that crazy stuff got said. And so our people fought modernism. So they were working. But I'm not sure how carefully they were watching. Because in that fight, the arguments they used and the materials they used and the theology they used swept our church into Protestant categories of thought. So they should have found a way to work and not let that happen. Now, I'm not blaming them. I maybe would have done the same thing. But that is what happened. That's how we finally, by the end of the century, had what I call a save me gospel. And the kingdom gospel that our people had begun with was very badly eroded. It wasn't completely gone. We always thought church was important. We couldn't have explained maybe why from the kingdom teaching. But yeah. So it's important that we watch and wait, okay? Watch and pray. Work against modernism, but be sure that while you're doing that, something doesn't sneak in unawares. Well, the fourth point is dispelling discouragement. I have just one verse there. What was going on is when you have pressures without, you also tend to have problems within that are aggravated, okay? The 10 spies, they went into the land of Canaan, they saw problems, and they came back and problems began in the nation because of it. They said, we're not able, okay? Now notice who does the discouraging here. It's Judah. Well, these people had the blood of David, royalty in their veins. What's going on here? Well, we find out later in the book that these people were benefiting because they had intermarried and they had wealth and they were dependent on these people. And so, what did they do? Well, they kept telling these people, we know what those people are planning. You know why? Because they were talking to them. And eventually they're gonna come in and they're gonna attack you. And it says 10 times. My study shows that this was 10 times as a way of saying many times. So they were constantly instilling fear in these people by these rumors that they heard from these people. Now, I kind of think one of the things that was going on is I think Sanballat and his cronies knew that Nehemiah had letters from the king of Persia. And what was going on here is all they had was threats because they knew that they could not really attack them with impunity. I kind of think that's what was going on here. But they didn't know that for sure. They didn't know what kind of tactics they would use. So, discouragement from God's own people. Now, why were they discouraged? Well, I think they were tired. Look what it says. It says, the bearers of the burdens is decayed. You know, when you start a project, everybody's all excited. They're all excited. And to get the wall half up, and it was so much work. They were tired. And they said there was a lot of rubble. They had to, did you ever do a job that before you could even do the job, you had to clear away a bunch of stuff? That's not fun. And so they were in the middle of this. They were tired. There was still piles of rubble. They couldn't even build till they cleared away rubble, and they just were tired, and they were discouraged. All right? We are not able to build the wall. That's what their adversaries were telling them. Okay? They shall not know, neither see, till we come in amidst of them and slay them and cause the work to cease. So that's what they're saying out there. And so my final point is they were facing fear. Now, you all know that Theodore Roosevelt said we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Well, he was actually borrowing what? Did I say Theodore? No, it was FDR. Okay. He actually was quoting Henry David Thoreau. My wife tells me when I get home all the misspeaking that I've done. All right. He was actually borrowing from Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau was the person who first said something like this: "Nothing is so much to be feared but fear." All right. And so they kept telling him, they're making all these plots out there. But Nehemiah was a good leader. He was a good leader. He did a number of things, and it won't take me long. This will be a short sermon. He did a number of things to deal with the issue. All right? Number 1, verse 13. He says, "Therefore said I, in the lower places behind the wall and on the higher places, I even set the people after their families with their swords and their spears and their bows." And he says, look, you people are fighting for your families. Now, there's nothing that gets people more determined to deal with an issue if they know it's going to affect their family. It's amazing what some people will do if it affects their family. And so he says, look, fight for your families. He unified them toward a goal, which was to protect their families. Number 2, verse 14. "And I looked and I rose up and said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, Be not ye afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters and your wives and your houses." So I said, look, you need to keep looking to God. He's a great and terrible God. And that's what a good leader does. He never loses sight of his resources, which is the resources of the whole universe and more besides. It's the God of creation, okay? Get your eyes off the rubbish. Get your eyes off of yourselves. And notice what happened. Finally, after the ridicule, after the plots, and after the discouragement. Verse 15. "And it came to pass, when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, everyone into his work." So they finally backed off. But Nehemiah had learned a lesson, and that is there had to be continued vigilance. For the time being, the enemy had backed off, and some people, when that happens, then they relax. Nehemiah said, look, they threatened us, and they said all this, and they did all this. We're not going to trust them. We're absolutely not going to trust them. They're our enemies, and we're not going to trust them. And so he called them to action. It wasn't just prayer. They held their weapons in one hand and they built with the other. And you know, all people who have had a great contribution to the kingdom of God have done that. They haven't just prayed. You had Mena Simons, who was constantly writing. You had Dirk Phillips, who was constantly writing. You had John Bunyan thrown into prison 3 times, and he gives us Pilgrim's Progress. You have William Wycliffe, who was a teacher, but he was also translating the New Testament into Greek. We need to act. We don't just sit there and pray and say, well, you know, I see a lot of leaders that just sort of think, well, if they pray and they just trust God, that he'll take care of everything. No, God calls us to action. He calls us to be wise, to do things that will help the situation. And so what did they do? Well, you know, that they held their spears and they worked with one hand. There was also a whole group of them that stood by, ready to fight. And then they had a rallying point. He says, when you hear the trumpet, we're all going to get together. You know, I have many people call me who are discouraged and depressed. And the first thing I say to them is, what's happening? Are you getting support from your church? Oh, I don't have a church. What? Oh, I'm done with the church. I'm just going to live my life by myself. Well, I said, you have set yourself up for defeat. God never designed the Christian life to be lived individually. You won't find anything like that in the Bible. It's all about a people. It's all about a church. It's all about confessing your faults one to another and supporting each other and working together. And so he made plans that if we're attacked, I have a plan that'll get us all together. There's going to be a trumpeter standing by my side. And if he hears any hint of any problem, you're all going to get together and we're going to fight this all together. So we have now, he called them to fight for their families. And I think we need to think about that. I mean, I think about it all the time. I can't make it happen, but I can do all I possibly can to pass on a good legacy to my family. And then pray every day that that'll go down through the generations. So we should focus on our families. The way some people do, though, is they do that, and then it doesn't turn out quite the way it should, and then they compromise, and they go with the family rather than stand. You know, a bishop told my parents one time, the best thing you can do for your children is to stand clear so they know where you are. So I'll put that in there for what it's worth. He directed their attention to God. He called them to act, not just pray. He called them to action while they were praying. He had a rallying point that there was going to be there was going to be a whole group of them face the enemy. They weren't going to be on, he said, you're all separated on the wall. We'll not defeat the enemy that way if they attack. I'll blow the trumpet, and wherever you hear the trumpet, you rally, okay? David had a Jonathan. Elijah had an Elisha, and you can go down through the scriptures. They did not fight alone. And finally, develop a mentality of serving. He says, you people who come in from the country, don't go back to your homes at night. You stay here. You be here to help us guard this city. And don't worry so much about your own personal needs. I didn't even take off my clothes except to wash. I was always ready. I was ready to serve. And so there we have those 4 points that I think are very important. Focus on our families. Direct our attention to God, the great and terrible God. Know that if he's in the picture and you have a cause that you can defend from the gospel and you're meek, you're doing it in the right way, then you can depend on God. You can depend on God. Don't only pray, but couple prayer with action. Fight with your brothers. Don't do this alone. And have a serving mentality. The enemy could not stop them, as Alan Redpath said, and I say it in closing. The enemy could not stop these people because they had a mind to work, verse 6. They had a heart to pray, verse 9. They had an eye to watch, verse 9. And they had an ear to listen. And God help us. We're living in a time of great apostasy, a lot of confusion, a lot of carnality. Let's fight well. Let's be a Nehemiah. Let's trust God. Let's act while we pray. Let's work together. Let's unify ourselves. Let's fight for our families. And let's have a servant spirit. Does anybody have any comments you'd like to make?